Hi everyone, welcome to the 1-800-RESPECT webinar series. Today's topic is elder abuse and family. 1-800-RESPECT is pleased to welcome Gary Ferguson. Gary has been the Community Education Coordinator with Seniors' Rights Victoria since it was first established in 2008. During this time, he has developed elder abuse education programs for different populations of seniors, including people from different cultures. He also coordinates the professional education program for the service. Seniors' Rights Victoria provides information, support, advice, and education to help prevent elder abuse and safeguard the rights, dignity, and independence of older people. This webinar is live and interactive. You are encouraged to participate by posing questions to the presenter. Your questions can be typed into the chat box, which is located at the bottom left-hand side of your screen. Responses to your questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. I'd now like to pass you over to Gary to begin.
Hello everybody. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're on and their elders past and present. Before I commence the presentation, I just want to say that this is a 30-minute presentation, and as such it can't be comprehensive in what it covers with regard to elder abuse. So I suppose my advice to you is to seek out professional education if you wish, which is more comprehensive following up from this presentation. The other thing to say is that this is not legal advice, and as such, if you do need specific legal advice regarding any of these matters, then what I'd urge you to do is to contact a legal service for that. Okay, just to give you an overview of what we're going to talk about today, first I'll talk a little bit about Seniors' Rights Victoria and the service that we offer. I'm then going to talk about Australia's ageing population and ageism, and the reason I do this at the beginning is really to set a context for what we're going to talk about in the main part of the presentation, which is elder abuse. I'll initially define elder abuse and talk about some of the different types, and then we'll look at some of the data including prevalence. I suppose what I've been asked to do today is to really look at how do we assess whether an older person is being abused or mistreated, and what might be some of the appropriate responses for that. And then towards the end, I'll look at considerations including culturally and linguistically diverse populations, Aboriginals, older men, and gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, and intersex populations. At the end of the presentation is a slide or information about resources and also the references I've used during the presentation, which I'd encourage you to follow up and read. Seniors' Rights Victoria is funded by the Victorian Government through the Department of Health, Aged Care and Victorian Legal Aid. It's important to say that we are a service based in Victoria, but there are similar services and agencies based in other states and territories throughout Australia. Seniors' Rights Victoria is a statewide free and confidential service, and we have a telephone helpline which is 1300 368 821. We're a unique service in that we provide advocacy, non-legal and legal support and assistance to clients who come to us with regard to elder abuse. We also provide community and professional education, and we provide a range of communications through the internet and printed resources. You can find all of this information on our website. Okay, so just to get underway, what I'm going to talk about to start with is Australia's ageing population. And in 2013, there were 23.1 million people living in Australia. The number of people over 65 years of age increased from 11.6% in 1993 to 14.4% in 2013. So of the current population, that equates to about 3.3 million people. This is projected to increase more rapidly over the next decade as baby boomers turn 65 years of age. The largest increases in the number of people over 65 years of age in the last decade were in the Northern Territory, the ACT and Western Australia. The other thing to say is that the number of people over 85 years of age in the last decade doubled to 1.9%. There were almost twice as many women in this group, 283,100, as men, which were 156,500, which sort of, I suppose, substantiates the claim that women live longer than men. In the Victorian government, the other thing to say is that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population was about 669,000, of which there are about 29,000 over 65 years of age. And over a third of people over 65 years of age were born overseas. In the Victorian government's publication Seniors Count, 4 main trends are identified in Australia's ageing population over the next century. They are: people will live longer, people over 65 years of age are an increasingly diverse population, seniors will want to be healthy as possible as they age, and seniors will want more personal control over their decisions. Okay, before we move into elder abuse, what I want to talk about very briefly is ageism, because in a way, elder abuse is as a direct result of ageism in our community. Ageism is discrimination and stereotyping based on age. It stigmatises people of the same age as sharing all the same negative qualities. So, for example, we might say young people are inexperienced, immature, and are unreliable. And by doing that, what we're doing is stigmatising young people with all those negative characteristics. For older men and women, ageism leaves them disregarded and discredited as a group. It has the potential to create a society that doesn't uphold the rights of older people and is less inclined to protect vulnerable seniors. In the work that we do in agencies and services throughout Australia around elder abuse, what we usually do is follow United Nations principles for older persons. And I think that it's really important and relevant to look at these very closely. Today, I'm just going to talk to you about the 5 different areas that set of principles covers. They are independence, participation, care, self-fulfillment, and dignity. And if you put United Nations Principle for Older Persons in your favourite search engine, you'll be able to read a lot more detail about those 5 principles. What I want to say is that a connection with ageism to elder abuse might be manifested by ascribing signs and symptoms to the ageing process, for example, and not fully exploring them, or treating disclosures of abuse and mistreatment as dismissive due to assumed cognitive impairment or dementia-related illnesses. Okay, so that sets the context for what we're going to talk about in elder abuse. It's important to recognise that our population is ageing and that we do see examples of ageism throughout the Australian population. All right, moving on to the definition. Elder abuse is several forms of mistreatment of an older person that is committed by someone with whom the older person has a relationship of trust, such as a partner, family member, friend, or unpaid carer. So someone who might be providing care and assistance to the older person. Now, this is the definition that is generally accepted throughout Western countries, and it's the definition that agencies in Australia work with when working with survivors of abuse. Elder abuse is seen in all social, cultural, religious, non-religious, rural and urban and economic groups of older people. So there's no specific profile for this. It can include acts of commission, so abuse and mistreatment, and acts of omission, such as neglect, which are intentional, malicious, willful, or deliberate. Abuse can commence very subtly. So, for example, it might be removing items of value from the older person's residence without asking, through to being quite major, such as sexual assault or rape. In this particular definition, the relationship of trust doesn't include any relationships which involve a consumer transaction or professional association. So it's important to remember that this particular relationship of trust is usually with family members or with close relatives in most circumstances, or close friends. All right, we're going to have a little bit of a poll now, just to find out what your work relationship with elder abuse is. So the question is, how common is elder abuse in your work with older people? And we put a number of percentages there. Okay, so what we're seeing is that generally, for most of you, it's about 1 to 5%. For some, it's a little bit higher. In fact, probably for about half of you, it's over 10%. And there's a few of you who it's 50% or more, and that might be because you're working specifically in an elder abuse field. Okay, we can finish the poll there. All right. Little was known about elder abuse until the late 1980s, and when it was identified more and was seen as a social, medical, health and legal problem in the Australian community. The prevalence of elder abuse in Australia is unclear, and this is mainly because of inconsistencies in defining the different types of elder abuse, and data collection methodologies make it difficult to estimate the prevalence. The other thing to say is that understanding what constitutes elder abuse is a problem. So recently, I was at the National Elder Abuse Conference in Western Australia, and a Canadian professor presented on a Canadian elder abuse prevalence study. And in that study, they asked a question of the respondents, which was something along the lines of, have you been subjected to elder abuse? And in most cases, they responded with no. But when the question drilled down a bit more specifically around examples of elder abuse, so for example, have you had money taken from you by a close relative or family member, the respondents responded with yes. So even though they were saying that they hadn't experienced elder abuse, when it was drilled down a bit more, what the professor was saying was that the respondents was answering yes to those questions. So understanding what elder abuse is in the community is a huge problem in terms of being able to determine what the prevalence is. However, international research estimates that about 3 to 6% of older people will be subjected to elder abuse. We do know that there is considerable underreporting of elder abuse by survivors, and this may result in the estimate being well below the actual incidence of elder abuse in the community. Women are 2 to 3 times more likely to be subjected to elder abuse than men. Older women experience elder abuse differently from older men. For example, older women or women tend to live longer than men in Australia, as we saw in the population trends that I discussed at the beginning. And some studies have found women are more likely to be financially, sexually and physically abused than men, and to be abused by a wider range of family members. One study found older women are more likely to be on an aged pension than men and are not likely to be financially secure as much as men. On average, men make up 1 in 4 cases of elder abuse, and I'll talk a little bit about that later in the presentation. So what that demonstrates is that this is a very different paradigm to domestic violence. About 5% of older people presenting to aged care services in Australia have been abused or mistreated. So as we saw in the poll question, with some of you, the incidence of what you're seeing in your work is about 1 to 5%. All right, I just wanted to look at some data in Australia. And the reason I picked these particular 2 states, firstly because I'm from Victoria, and so I've used my own service in this. But the reason I picked Queensland is because they have expressed their data in percentages as well, and therefore it gives us a little bit of a comparison that's similar. What we would see in most of the work in the agencies and services that are working specifically in this area in Australia is that most of the abuse is reflected in these particular tables. The most prevalent types of abuse are psychological, emotional, and financial abuse. And that's what we see mostly at Seniors Rights Victoria, and other agencies and services around Australia would see that as well. It's important to say that there's some limitations of this data because what we're seeing is callers are self-selecting into the service. So they have to take the step to come to the service and to talk about the abuse. It doesn't tell us about the abuse and mistreatment that might be happening for other people that never comes to services like Seniors Rights Victoria or the Elder Abuse Prevention Unit in Queensland. The other thing I want to say is that this word advices refers to more individualised response to abuse by solicitors and advocates at Seniors Rights Victoria. So it doesn't necessarily tell us the total number of calls. Therefore, what we're seeing in the different types of abuse is, for example, that there are very few advices around or no advices around neglect, social or sexual abuse. In Queensland, however, in the types of calls that they get to their Elder Abuse Prevention Helpline, we're seeing that they get about 10% neglect, 7% physical, and then less in social and sexual. I do want to say a little bit about sexual abuse. What we're seeing in agencies around Australia is an underreporting of this. And usually it's generally underreported in the wider community as well. So we wouldn't likely to see a difference in that in these types of agencies or services. There is usually more than one type of abuse occurring when it occurs for someone. And between 40 to 50% of the perpetrators of elder abuse are the adult son or daughter of the older person, and these are in equal proportions. The majority of alleged perpetrators are close family members or relatives. And so what we see at somewhere like Seniors Rights Victoria is about half of the alleged perpetrators are the adult son or the adult daughter. I'm not going to go through the definitions of these different types of abuses because that will take up too much time. And what I'd suggest you do is that you refer to the websites in your various states or territories, and there'll be a full explanation of what they are. All right, so what might we see as indicators of elder abuse? And given that there is a time limitation on this, I've had to be very brief in how I explain it. But the general statement is that if there is a sudden or unexplained inconsistency in a person's lifestyle, health, financial affairs or emotional state, it may indicate that elder abuse is occurring if there has been a correlating event. So to give you an example, if an older person was living by themselves and they had some support services coming into the home, and those support services noticed that that older person, for example, was very well kept, they had food in the pantry, they paid their bills on time, and the place was generally clean. And then an adult member of the family moved into that house, and they began to see the older person maybe a bit fearful of contact with others, maybe not as well kept, maybe not having food in the pantry or in the fridge or in the cupboards, maybe also seeing that bills were piling up. What you would have to ask in that situation is whether elder abuse is occurring, given that the person's usual characteristics are now changed quite considerably and detrimentally. What I've put there on the slide is some examples of elder abuse under the different types, which sort of give you a bit more of an indicator specifically around what you might see if elder abuse is occurring. Elder abuse, as I said at the beginning, can be very subtle to extreme. So it might be little things that are occurring at the beginning, and it might become much more continuous and much more extreme as it goes on. The other thing to recognise is that the impacts for the older person can be more adverse because of their age. And because of this, it will have a lasting impact on their lifestyle. So it's important that if you are seeing indicators of elder abuse, you do something about it. Okay, here's the next poll question. So when abuse is suspected but not disclosed, what questions might you ask to explore the issue with the older person? And we've given you some choices down in the poll. So if you could respond with just one of those choices that you think might be most appropriate. Okay, so most people are saying, how are things going at home? Some people are saying, how do you spend your days? And usually, if you are seeing abuse or mistreatment occurring, but it's not being disclosed, it's best always to ask a question which is a bit more general, rather than being a bit more specific. Now, some people have, in fact, a considerable number of people have answered, are you being mistreated by partner, son, daughter, or relative? And we're going to talk about why that question might be inappropriate when you first are asking about elder abuse that's been suspected. Okay, let's finish the poll there and move on to the next slide. Before we get into specific responses, I just want to talk about some considerations if this is occurring with one of your clients or if you're working in the field and you suspect this type of abuse. The first thing is that the privacy and confidentiality of the person, the older person, is paramount in this. They may be telling you that they're being abused or mistreated, but they may not want you to tell anybody else at that time. Of course, whenever I do professional education, what I try to remind people is that they will have reporting processes in place with their organisation that they'll be obliged to follow. And it might be important to tell the survivor that this will be the case. If you've observed something which you think is elder abuse, it's important to discuss it with one of your colleagues or a supervisor or team leader, because you can't draw conclusions just from observations alone. So for example, I might walk past an older person in the street who's talking to a younger person and they might be talking very loudly. And that's how I might describe it. But another person walking past, hearing those two people talking loudly, might say they're having an argument. So it's drawing a huge conclusion from an observation that probably needs to be tested a bit more. Elder abuse, like any abuse or mistreatment in the family, is a complex issue which usually involves family dynamics. And it's important to recognise that and that each situation is unique. So even if someone comes to us at a service like Seniors Rights Victoria and they tell us essentially that they're being financially abused, we don't just see that as financial abuse. What we see it as is abuse or mistreatment for that person as an individual and for their particular context. And in doing that, we have to understand the older person and respect his or her rights. You will have a professional role in this, I'm assuming, in terms of your employment, and you will need to follow reporting processes. The other thing I always stress is that elder abuse can impact on professionals and workers as well, in a personal way. When I first started at Seniors Rights Victoria, for the first 6 months I was pretty gobsmacked at what we were seeing coming through the helpline. And it does have an impact on people, and it's important that if that occurs for you, that you take up some counselling or some professional support in that capacity. All right. So let's look at more specifically how you would respond to this. And it's important to remember that whatever you do in the first instance when discussing elder abuse with the survivor will have a lasting impression on him or her. It will either build trust and result in more openness, or have the potential to shut the survivor down and not talk about the abuse or mistreatment. A trusting relationship between staff of services and agencies and survivors can lead to shifts in the survivor's responses to the abuse. So that's really important to remember. When there is any suspicion or disclosure of abuse or mistreatment, be sensitive asking questions of the survivor. If there is a suspicion of abuse and not a disclosure, ask more indirect questions, such as how are you finding living with your son? How do you spend your day? And as you saw in the poll question that we asked, the majority of you sort of responded with those sort of general questions. Of course, you wouldn't ask these questions out of the blue. You might introduce them during a conversation rather than asking them unexpectedly. Any suspicion, disclosure and discussion should be documented and managed within organisational protocol. A more comprehensive assessment might involve a funded assessment service or other health and community care workers. Collaborative responses have proven to be very effective in addressing elder abuse. In considering the older person's mental capacity if required, a formal assessment by an appropriate service or clinician might be appropriate. And it's important to discuss with the older person how they want to respond to the abuse. Initially, they may only want to talk about it, and this may occur several times before he or she is ready to take action. The survivor's response will obviously influence any intervention. Okay, so let's look at responses and management. And responses should generally aim to achieve minimum disruption to the usual lifestyle and least restrictive care alternatives for the survivor. Ensuring the older person's safety might involve the development of a safety plan with the person, application for an intervention or restraining order, or liaison with local police. By informing the older person of their rights and options, such as legal services and care packages, you are, 1, ensuring that you are working within a human rights approach, 2, returning control to the survivor by involving them in the decision making, and 3, you can determine realistic options for the survivor. Provision of community support might include home or personal care, planned activity groups, volunteering opportunities, meals on wheels. Community support can introduce contact with people outside the context of the abuse, and therefore put the survivor in a very different situation. Alternative accommodation might be necessary as well. Sometimes legal interventions are required, and this can be helpful in stopping the abuse. It's important, however, to remember that a lot of people in this age demographic won't have familiarity with legal processes, and so they will need considerable assistance and support in this. Some examples of legal interventions might be enduring powers of attorney, appointing agents or attorneys who can act in the best interest of the older person and manage finances and other aspects of the older person's life, or intervention orders or civil action. Okay, so I've got another poll question now. This is the last poll question. And I suppose the question is, if the survivor is anxious to take action to stop emotional abuse, what options might you follow? So there's a number of options there. Which would be the most appropriate option, do you think? Okay, so what we're seeing is a high percentage of you are saying that you should provide the survivor with information about support and assistance available, and some of you are saying contact the police and inform them or tell other family members. I think if the survivor is anxious about taking action, the first thing to do might be just to talk with them about support and assistance that's available before they start thinking about taking action. And then following that, you might take more serious actions such as contacting the police and informing them. Okay, let's move on to the last couple of slides. I did say at the beginning that what I was going to talk about was gender and cultural issues, and I'm going to talk about this for a little bit. The first group is culturally and linguistically diverse populations. Older people from cold populations might be at increased risk of elder abuse because of language difficulties and cultural values. This might result in greater dependency on families to assist the older person in such things as translating documents. Elder abuse doesn't always translate with the same meaning for some cold populations, and so there may be a lack of understanding of what constitutes elder abuse, as I sort of demonstrated in the Canadian prevalence study. I just want to say that at the moment, the Ethnic Communities Council of Victoria has been working with several cold communities and uses narratives as a way of raising awareness of elder abuse. And recently they produced Within These Walls, an educational DVD dubbed into 8 different languages. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander populations can include abuse in these populations, and mistreatment can include exploitation of kinship and family responsibilities and obligations. These kinship and family obligations might be different to the relationship of trust that we understand in the definition. A report on elder abuse in Aboriginal communities in Western Australia by their Office of Public Advocate in 2005 found in Aboriginal families relationships involve strong cultural obligations between grandparents and grandchildren, parents and children. There are also other issues to consider when working with populations of Indigenous Australians. These include lateral violence, shame, oppression, the impact of the stolen generations, and loss of traditional respect for elders as custodians of the culture. The Advocacy and Rights Service of South Australia has built strong relationships with Aboriginal communities individually and through the South Australian Council of Elders. They've produced resources including a DVD, The Tradition of Respect, a mentoring camp 2012. There's been negligible research specifically on older gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender and intersex populations and elder abuse. When I was in New York in 2013, I visited the Services and Advocacy for GLBTI elders, referred to as SAGE, and spoke with their Senior Director of Programs. What she told me she found in working with elders from those populations who had been abused or mistreated was that they were less likely to disclose elder abuse for fear of further discrimination related to their sexuality or gender. And given that this particular age demographic would have had considerable discrimination over a number of years, they're more fearful of coming to services that deal with these types of matters. Their support networks might be smaller, and therefore they don't want to jeopardise that network, and their social isolation might be greater because of hostility. Very little attention is being paid in research into the impact of elder abuse and gender. Men in this age demographic will have strong notions of masculinity, and therefore they'll adopt approaches to abuse and mistreatment which reflect this. For example, men don't complain, men must take care of themselves, men who are mistreated are weak. Older men might be less likely to recognise and label feelings of distress as problematic. This can result in older men seeking help much later on when the situation becomes critical. Currently, Seniors Rights Victoria is piloting forums which encourage older men to talk about issues of concern early. These are called Legal Matters for Older Fellows. Okay, the final slide, just in terms of conclusion. If the ageing population increases rapidly over the next 2 decades, then there is a potential for elder abuse to increase amongst this population. It's important, therefore, for professionals and workers who are working with older people to become more aware of the indicators of elder abuse, and for organisations and service providers to develop collaborative and holistic responses to address elder abuse. Raising awareness about elder abuse in the Australian community through professional and community education will be imperative in ensuring that alleged perpetrators don't act with impunity. You can find out more about education by contacting your nearest elder abuse service or helpline. Detailed research into elder abuse in Australia is required so that we can fully understand the problem and develop appropriate responses. And most importantly, support and assistance needs to be readily available for survivors of elder abuse. Thank you.
Thanks, Gary, for the informative presentation. I think we all now have a very good understanding of elder abuse. Okay, we're now going to open up for a few questions for Gary to answer. If you would like to ask a question, please do so by typing the questions into the chat box at the bottom left of your screen. Please note that case-specific information cannot be answered during this webinar. We have had a few questions come through. The first question is, what stops people talking about elder abuse?
Okay. Well, there are a number of things that might prevent people from talking about elder abuse. This could be because they fear that there'll be retribution if they go and talk about it by the perpetrator of the abuse. It could be that they fear that they'll be punished or that they'll be isolated even further. Other things that sort of impact on people talking about abuse can be that family loyalties and codes might come into play. For example, a parent who might have an adult offspring living at home might be particularly loyal to that adult child and very reluctant to go and talk to anybody about that. Another thing that does impact on people as to whether they'll talk about abuse is not being aware of the options which are available to them. So a number of people might think, well, if I talk about this abuse, the police are going to become involved, the family member will be charged and incarcerated. Whereas in agencies throughout Australia that work specifically in this area, what we try and do is offer a range of options to the older person so that they can think about how they might stop the abuse within the particular context of which they're living. So there's some of the responses.
Thank you. I have another question coming through. What might put an older person of increased risk of elder abuse?
There are a number of things that put people at increased risk. What I can tell you is what we see at Seniors Rights Victoria. So usually what we will see is that the older person might be dependent on the alleged perpetrator for a number of things. So, for example, driving the older person to the doctors, they might require the perpetrator to take them shopping, those sorts of things. If that dependency exists and there's no other services or people involved in that older person's life and they're therefore quite isolated, it could put them at increased risk of being abused or mistreated. Other things that put people at increased risk that we see some of at Seniors Rights Victoria, and I know other agencies and services throughout Australia see it as well, is where there is addiction involved, addiction related to substance use or alcohol or gambling. And those things might impact on the abuse of the older person in that the perpetrator is seeking accommodation, for example, inappropriately, seeking finances or seeking to misappropriate finances from the older person. Some other things that put people at increased risk, obviously, are social isolation. If the older person is in contact with other people, even if it's within their own neighbourhood, and they're not able to talk to people about issues of concern, then it does put them at increased risk as well.
Thank you, Gary. I have another question coming through from Marlene. This is regarding the definition. Why only related to relationship of trust and not including strangers to elderly?
I think, now I'm really taking a guess at this, but because the definition was sort of there when I started work at Seniors Rights Victoria 6 years ago. I think the reason that this particular definition exists with agencies and services like Seniors Rights Victoria is because prior to those agencies and services being set up, there was very little that an older person could do in terms of being able to address the abuse, where there was a relationship of trust in that situation of abuse, and given that those relationships of trust are usually with family. So I suppose that's why we don't include strangers, one. And the second reason would be if an elderly person is being abused by a stranger and they did come to a service like Seniors Rights Victoria, we would, depending on what the abuse or the mistreatment is, we would refer them to another authority or another service which would be able to deal with that. So for example, what I'm thinking of particularly is people who come knocking at an older person's door with a scam, for example, which is quite common, and older people are very vulnerable to that and can be exploited in that situation, and essentially the person who is trying to scam the older person is a stranger. There are a number of other services and authorities which deal with that sort of consumer fraud. And so this particular definition relates very specifically to family and friends and carers where there is no professional association or any consumer transaction.
Thank you, Gary. We have time for one more question. This question is from Carl. Is legislation required to protect older people?
I think certainly there is some moves around having elder law legislation which might be about protecting older people. The question might imply whether we require mandatory reporting. In Australia, we don't have mandatory reporting around elder abuse. The approach by governments has been to take a human rights approach where the older person has the right to make choices about how the abuse will be stopped. However, in some other international jurisdictions, mandatory reporting does exist, and particularly, for example, in the United States of America. My understanding is that even though mandatory reporting still exists, or exists in those jurisdictions, the older person still has the choice around whether they will take further action or not. And in a number of cases where mandatory reporting occurs in the United States of America, the older person chooses not to take any further action.
Thank you, Gary. Well, it looks like we're just about out of time. Thank you, Gary, for answering all those questions, and thank you, everyone, for attending today's webinar. If you would like a certificate of attendance for participating in the webinar, you can download the certificate that just appeared in the chat box just by clicking on the hyperlink, please. Thank you. On behalf of the entire 1-800-RESPECT team, I thank you for attending this webinar and hope that you have found it valuable. Please stay online now to take our quick survey. Thank you.